No religion at all. No church, mosque, saint, prophet, baptism, etc. No evolution theory or ages. No alcohol, tobacco, drugs. No pig, pork, or donkey meat. No meditation, mysticism, astrology, horoscopes. No statues, idols. Calm, bedtime storytelling style. 14th century, plus details. Earlier only if factual, no theories. Hook at the start. After hook in chapter 1. Hello everyone, plus gentle subscription reminder. Subscription reminders only in chapters 1, 5, 9, no meta chapter endings like chapter complete. Each chapter 6,000 plus words in one single message. Now I will begin with chapter 1 of the strange tricks people used to keep rats out of their food. Chapter 1. When shadows had whiskers, had you ever sat in a quiet room only to hear the faint sound of scratching, a sound so small it could be dismissed, yet so steady it sets your skin on edge? For people of centuries past, that sound was more than a nuisance. It was a warning that their food, their labor, and even their safety were under threat. Rats were more than background creatures. They were constant intruders, and the tricks used to keep them away became as essential to survival as the food itself. Hello everyone and welcome. Tonight we'll step into the forgotten world of quiet nights and the struggles people faced not only against hunger, but against the creatures that stole from them. As you drift into this story, I gently remind you to subscribe so you can join these long journeys into the past again and again, each night filled with calm history. Rats thrived in the shadows of human life. Wherever there was grain stored, bread baked, cheese laid out, or dried fish stacked for the winter, rats followed. They squeezed through cracks no wider than a thumb, gnawed through wood and cloth, and appeared in places where one believed no creature could fit. Unlike dogs or cats, which people chose to keep, rats chose people. They built their lives upon what humans gathered, and for centuries this made them uninvited companions in kitchens, barns, and storerooms. But if rats were clever, people were inventive. Every household, from the poorest hut to the richest hall, had tricks to outwit them. Some were simple, born of observation. Others were strange, products of desperation. And many, while effective for a time, revealed just how stubborn these whiskered shadows could be. The first trick was height. People noticed that rats preferred low, dark paths. So food was raised on platforms, hung from beams, or placed on shelves that seemed just out of reach. In barns, grain sacks were suspended by ropes tied to rafters. In kitchens, dried meats or wheels of cheese were strung on hooks. Bread, precious and hard-earned, was sometimes placed in baskets hanging from the ceiling. Have you ever seen fruit hung in a cellar to keep it fresh? Imagine entire meals swaying above the floor, not for preservation alone, but as a defense against gnawing teeth. Yet rats adapted. They climbed ropes with the ease of acrobats. They leapt farther than expected, sometimes clearing gaps that seemed impossible. And so the people adjusted again. Ropes were greased with fat or oil, making them too slippery to climb. Hooks were curved outward, harder for small claws to grip. Beams were polished or wrapped in metal to keep teeth from finding hold. Each adjustment became a new line in the battle, a small but vital trick in the endless war. Another trick was the use of sound. People learned that rattling objects unnerved rats, disrupting their patterns. In some storerooms, strings of dried shells or pieces of pottery were hung where food was kept. At night, when rats scurried, their bodies brushed against the strings, and the sudden clatter startled them. Imagine being a rat, creeping silently, only to send a rain of shells clinking into the dark. Many fled at once, and the noise served as both warning to the household and punishment to the intruder. Some travelers even carried small bells for the same purpose, tying them to sacks so the faintest disturbance would give alarm. The third trick was light. Rats, being creatures of the shadow, disliked fire and brightness. Torches and oil lamps kept burning near storerooms discouraged their entry. But flames were costly, oil scarce, and candles not easily wasted. People needed their light for work, not for guarding food. And so they compromised, burning small fires and hearths at night, and trusting the glow to deter whiskered thieves. It worked, but only partially. Rats learned to wait in the darker corners until flames dimmed, their patience stronger than human supplies. Perhaps the most curious trick was scent. People discovered that certain strong smells discouraged rats. Herbs like mint and tansy were scattered across floors or tucked into sacks of grain. Their sharpness seemed to overwhelm rat senses, driving them elsewhere. Dried lavender, often used to freshen air, was sometimes hung in storerooms less for beauty than for defense. Even strong-smelling oils were smeared on doors or cracks to keep rats from squeezing through. Have you ever noticed how certain odors linger, filling every corner of a room? For rats, those scents became barriers, invisible walls that turned them aside. But tricks were not always so gentle. Some people set clever traps, designed not with iron, but with simplicity. A clay pot balanced on a stick, baited with grain, would fall when disturbed, trapping the rat inside. Barrels filled with water and topped with floating boards lured rats to climb, only for them to tumble in. Buckets smeared with fat or honey sent rats slipping into depths they could not escape. These were not grand inventions, but the quiet ingenuity of those who refused to let their labor vanish into the mouths of pests. There was also the trick of movement. People learned that rats feared unfamiliar changes. A sack left too long in one place became an easy target, but a sack shifted daily confused them. Furniture rearranged, baskets rotated, shelves cleared. All created an air of uncertainty that discouraged bold intruders. It was as if the house itself shifted to defend against them. Have you ever moved an object and noticed how animals sniff carefully, uncertain of the change? Rats did the same, and in that hesitation, food remained safe a little longer. Not all tricks were clever. Some were desperate. People sprinkled ashes around storerooms, believing the grit irritated rats' feet and made them avoid crossing. Others scattered sand mixed with sharp shells, hoping to cut or discomfort them. Still, others believed loud clapping at intervals during the night was enough to drive them off. Imagine households waking in turns, not to check on children or fire, but to scare away unseen creatures with bursts of noise. It may sound strange, but desperation makes even the oddest ideas worth trying. And still, rats endured. For every trick that worked, another was overcome. They chewed through wood, tunneled through earth, learned paths over rooftops. The battle never ended. Yet in the persistence of tricks, and the ropes greased, herbs scattered, shells hung, and sacks shifted, we see the resilience of people determined to guard what little they had. Because for them, food was not simply a meal. It was survival through winter, strength for labor, hope for families. To lose it to rats was to lose more than bread or grain. It was to lose the result of days of toil, nights of worry, and the fragile promise of enough. Every trick mattered because every morsel mattered. So as night deepened under timber beams and stone arches, the struggle continued. Shadows with whiskers on one side, and the quiet, persistent ingenuity of humans on the other. And in that contest, every sound, every scent, every trick became part of a story not of triumph, but of endurance. Have you ever thought about how fragile food really is? One loaf of bread left out too long grows hard or moldy. A bag of grain, left unguarded, draws not only dust but intruders. A wheel of cheese, heavy and rich, can shrink night by night if something hungry chews away at its edges. For families of centuries past, food was not simply something to prepare and enjoy. It was the very result of months of effort. The difference between hunger and health, the security of knowing tomorrow would not be empty. And for all the work it took to produce food, it took just as much cunning to protect it. If you imagine an old storeroom, perhaps your mind fills with the image of barrels stacked neatly, shelves lined with jars, baskets brimming with grain or fruit. But for those who lived in the 15th, 16th, or 17th centuries, the storeroom was not so peaceful a place. It was a battlefield fought in silence against whiskers and claws and teeth that never tired. Rats never respected ownership. They knew nothing of toil or harvest. For them, every pile of grain was a feast. Every crumb left on a table was a path to survival. And so the people who guarded their homes had to develop tricks of storage that became as important as farming itself. One of the first strategies was the barrel. Barrels were more than containers for liquids. They were used to store grain, flour, salted meat, dried fish, and even fruits preserved in syrup. Made of oak or fir, bound by iron hoops, a barrel seemed impenetrable. But people soon learned that rats could gnaw even through thick staves if given time. The trick, then, was not merely to store food in barrels, but to outwit the rat before its teeth succeeded. Some families placed their barrels on platforms raised by smooth posts, impossible for claws to grip. Others set their barrels in shallow basins of water so that any rat attempting to climb the supports found itself swimming instead. It is easy to picture the scene. A row of barrels standing like soldiers, their feet surrounded by water, while rats circled helplessly, thwarted for one more night. In other homes, baskets woven from reeds or straw were common storage. They were light and easy to move, but also vulnerable. To protect them, people coated the lower layers with ash or sand, creating an unpleasant taste and texture for any nose that dared approach. The trick was simple but effective. The rat would try a first nibble, recoil at the bitter grit, and seek an easier prize elsewhere. Imagine lifting the lid of a basket and finding not only grain, but a thin layer of ash spread carefully like invisible armor. Jars and crocks offered another line of defense. Thick clay jars sealed with wax or cloth kept grain, beans, or dried herbs safe for a time. But no jar was truly secure if it rested on the ground. Rats could topple them, break seals, or chip at softer parts. So people set jars inside wooden boxes or stone niches, each chosen not for beauty, but for safety. In wealthier homes, larders were built with niches high in the wall, accessible by ladder, but unreachable by rats. The effort of climbing to fetch food was worth the comfort of knowing it had survived the night untouched. Even simple sacks became tools of cunning. Grain sacks were hung from beams, tied tightly at the neck, and sometimes covered in cloth soaked with strong-smelling herbs. It was not unusual to find mint or tansy woven into the storage practices of the day. These scents did not spoil the grain, but they set up a barrier to the keen nose of a rat. In villages where herbs were plentiful, entire storerooms might smell strongly of plants, not for human taste, but for rodent defense. It is easy to imagine a traveler entering such a room and wrinkling their nose at the pungent air, while the family took comfort in knowing that the very odor meant safety. Markets developed their own defenses. Stalls that sold grain often raised their tables high off the ground. Merchants carried stools with legs set in bowls of water, creating moats against invaders. Some even placed sharp metal collars around posts, a practice you may have seen used in later centuries for birds climbing poles. These collars, smooth and sharp-edged, prevented rats from climbing upward. Customers laughed at the sight, but they returned to those merchants again and again, for their wares were whole, while others showed signs of nibbling. In granaries, entire towns invested in storage tricks. Large stone buildings were fitted with raised wooden floors and slits for ventilation, but the cleverest trick was in the design of the posts that held the granary aloft. These posts were carved with wide, flat tops, like inverted mushrooms, so that any rat climbing upward could not pass the smooth, overhanging lip. This design can still be seen in some places today, the memory of a time when even architecture itself was shaped by the need to defeat small but tireless enemies. But not all tricks were practical. Some were born of belief, and while not religious in nature, they still carried a kind of folklore logic. People spread chalk or soot across thresholds, convinced that rats disliked crossing white or black lines. Others kept bright copper coins near sacks of flour, thinking the shine and metal scent would deter whiskers. Though such practices lacked foundation, they persisted because sometimes they seemed to work, and in a world where one rat less meant a day of food saved, no method was too strange to try. Travelers, too, carried tricks with them. On the road, when inns were crowded or barns too full, they sometimes slept with their packs. To keep rats away, they sprinkled dried mint inside their bags or tied small bells to the flaps. When a rat nosed too close, the bell rang softly, enough to stir the sleeper awake. Can you picture the scene? A tired wanderer jerking upright at the faint chime, swatting at the darkness while the rat vanished into shadow. It was not elegant, but it worked, and the pack remained intact. The most telling trick of all, however, was vigilance itself. Families checked storerooms each morning, sweeping for droppings, examining sacks for holes, listening for sounds in the walls. Markets closed with guards posted, not against thieves alone, but against smaller intruders. Children were tasked with clapping hands or stomping feet at intervals, driving unseen shadows from corners. The battle was not one of weapons, but of habits, woven daily into life. What is remarkable is not that people fought rats, but how creative they became in doing so. They turned barrels into fortresses, ropes into slippery traps, herbs into invisible barriers, architecture into weapon. And though they never won fully, for rats always returned, they bought themselves time. A week of safety, a month of preserved grain, a season of unspoiled bread. In the fragile balance of survival, that time was everything. As you think of these tricks, perhaps you realize something deeper. Storage was not simply about holding food. It was about guarding trust. Families trusted their larders to keep them through winter. Merchants trusted their stalls to bring honest trade. Villages trusted their granaries to carry them through famine. And so every trick written into storage was not only against rats, but for life itself. And yet, as clever as these methods were, the story was never finished. For as soon as humans built a new barrier, the rats found a new path. The battle stretched endlessly, through generations, through regions, through every quiet storeroom where a scratch in the night broke the illusion of safety. Have you ever noticed how a kitchen at night feels different from the same place by day? In the daytime it is bright with activity, knives chopping, pots bubbling, the warm smell of bread or stew filling every corner. But when the fire is out and the house grows silent, the same kitchen feels vulnerable. The smell of food still lingers, but no one is there to guard it. And it was in those silent hours, in kitchens and dining rooms of centuries past, that rats tested the patience and cleverness of every household. Unlike storerooms or granaries where food was kept in bulk, kitchens carried what was immediate. Loaves cooling on a wooden board, a wheel of cheese half-cut, a pot of broth waiting for the next meal. For rats, this was treasure laid out in the open. They crept across rafters, slipped through cracks in the door, darted along the base of the hearth. And so families developed tricks not only for storing food, but for protecting it even as it sat, ready for use. One common trick was the use of hanging cupboards. In many homes, cabinets were not built against walls, but suspended from beams, their bottoms left clear of the floor. Doors were made to fit tightly, with iron hinges that clamped shut. A rat might smell the food, but found no foothold. Some cupboards were fitted with smooth wooden legs that tapered to points and rested in shallow bowls of water. These acted like moats, creating barriers that rats could not cross. Picture a cupboard in the corner of a kitchen, standing tall and proud, its feet surrounded by shining basins. To the human eye it was odd. To the rat it was impassable. Tables themselves became part of the defense. Families often ate on raised boards supported by trestles. When the meal was finished, leftovers were placed not directly on the table, but inside wooden chests with lids. These meal chests, as they were sometimes called, were dragged into corners or even hoisted against walls. In some homes, people made the habit of turning tables on their sides after meals, leaving nothing flat for a rat to climb onto. It may sound extreme, but to those who knew the persistence of whiskered visitors, it was simply practical. In kitchens with open hearths, fires played a role in defense. The last embers of the evening were often stirred not only to preserve warmth for the next day, but to keep rats away. Rats disliked fire and rarely crossed glowing coals. So families spread embers near places where crumbs might have fallen, using the faint glow as both protection and preservation. A loaf of bread left near the warmth of the hearth kept dry and safe, while the faint barrier of heat discouraged invaders. Still, families needed tricks beyond fire. One such trick was the use of containers that rats could not easily chew. Earthenware crocks, glazed for smoothness, held butter or cheese. Lids were sealed with cloth dipped in wax, making them harder to penetrate. In some households, even pots were repurposed as defenses. A pot inverted over a plate of food acted as a shield, too heavy for a rat to move. Have you ever covered a dish to keep flies away in summer? Imagine doing the same, not for insects, but for creatures far more determined. The floor itself was a battlefield. Crumbs, no matter how small, invited company. Families learned to sweep carefully after each meal, using brooms of straw or reeds to brush even the smallest scraps into the fire. Children were sometimes tasked with this job, scouring corners for pieces that might draw intruders. To neglect sweeping was to invite scratching in the night. And so the sound of a broom on stone or wood became as important a defense as any cupboard. Another clever trick involved mixing scents. Strong-smelling herbs like mint, tansy, or rosemary were scattered on tables or tucked under boards. Their fragrance was pleasant to people, but sharp to rats. In some places, onions or garlic were left near food, not for flavor, but for their pungency. Have you ever entered a kitchen where the smell of herbs filled every breath? That same intensity was once a weapon, woven into daily routines, not only for taste, but for protection. Households also experimented with deterrents made of texture. Sharp grit or sand was sometimes sprinkled near tables, the rough surface discouraging soft feet. Broken shells were scattered at thresholds, making paths uncomfortable. Even the placement of rough mats or woven rugs was intentional. A rat might hesitate to cross the unfamiliar surface. In modern times, such measures may seem small, but in those days every obstacle counted. Kitchens that prepared food for many inns, manors, or large farms needed greater defenses. Servants rotated duties not just for cooking, but for guarding. At night, one might stay behind to listen for signs of intrusion, stamping feet or clapping hands to scare away movement. Dogs were sometimes allowed near kitchens, not only for company, but for their ears and instincts. The quiet growl of a dog at night was enough to make rats scatter. Yet not every home could afford such companions, and so most relied on simpler tricks. Even architecture adapted. In some kitchens, small alcoves were built into walls, high above the ground. These acted like shelves, out of reach unless one climbed. Bread was placed there to cool, cheeses left to rest, baskets tucked away. Families designed their living spaces with rats in mind, shaping stone and wood to frustrate intruders. Imagine building a house not only for people, but against pests. That was daily reality. Markets and inns used larger-scale tricks. In tavern kitchens where meals were prepared constantly, food was kept moving. Red loaves were stacked on trays suspended by chains from the ceiling, swinging gently above head height. Rats, however agile, could not leap that far. Meat was hung high in rafters, not only to dry but to stay out of reach. Grain was kept in bins with slanted sides, polished smooth so no creature could climb them. These designs were not decorative, but deliberate defenses, woven into commerce itself. But even in kitchens with all these precautions, people knew rats were clever. The best trick of all was vigilance. Each morning, food was inspected, coverings checked, crumbs swept again. Families spoke often of the importance of leaving nothing out. A single mistake could invite a week of trouble. To live in those times was to live in constant negotiation with unseen intruders. Every loaf, every plate, every scrap had to be accounted for. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of kitchens and tables long past. The act of eating was not only about preparing food, but about protecting it. Tricks were part of every meal, from how dishes were covered to how floors were swept, from how cupboards stood to how herbs were scattered. And while rats persisted, so did the people, each day rewriting their defenses, each night listening carefully for the whiskered shadows that tested their patience. Have you ever stepped into a barn late at night and felt how alive it seemed, even without people? The soft shift of straw, the rustle in the rafters, the faint scurry along a wall, these were the signs of more than animals kept for work. They were the signs of uninvited guests. Rats treated barns and storehouses as their kingdoms, for these buildings held exactly what they craved: grain, straw, and shelter. To defend such spaces, people had to invent tricks that went beyond the kitchen table, tricks that blended with the very way barns were built. Barns were the beating heart of a farm. Within them lay the year's harvest, stacks of hay, sacks of barley, bins of wheat, casks of dried beans. But this abundance also made them targets. Rats tunneled into piles, hollowing them from within. They gnawed holes in sacks until grain poured like sand. And once they claimed a corner, they bred quickly, filling the space with a population too large to ignore. The first trick to fight them was elevation. Farmers soon learned that keeping food on the ground was an invitation. So platforms were built, often with wide stone bases or wooden stilts. Sacks were stacked high with supports shaped deliberately to confuse small claws. Some supports were carved like hourglasses, narrowing in the middle, leaving no grip for a climbing rat. Others were polished smooth, making them too slick to ascend. If you've ever seen an old granary standing on mushroom-shaped posts, you've seen the legacy of this very trick. Another method was separation. Instead of stacking everything together, farmers spread sacks apart, creating gaps wide enough to prevent rats from leaping easily from one to another. This spacing also allowed quick inspection. If droppings or gnaw marks appeared, the guilty sack could be moved or burned before the infestation spread. Imagine walking through a storehouse lined not with towering walls of sacks, but with carefully spaced bundles, each watched closely, as if it were a guarded chest of treasure. Barn cats, where they were kept, played a role, but households never relied on them alone. Instead, they paired animal guardianship with human ingenuity. Some barns were fitted with trenches along the inside walls, filled with water to form barriers. Rats could swim, of course, but they hesitated to cross wide open stretches without cover. The trenches bought farmers time to hear the splashing, time to chase invaders away, time to notice the signs before more damage was done. Sound traps were common in barns, just as in kitchens. Strings of pottery shards, bits of metal, or dried gourds were hung along walls. When rats brushed them in the dark, the rattle woke even a light sleeper in the nearby loft. Farmers sleeping above their barns, exhausted from work, often relied on these sudden clatters to jolt them awake. It was not comfort, but it was warning. Some barns also used smoke. In seasons when hay was dry and danger of fire too great, farmers dared not use flame. But in cooler months, smoke from smoldering herbs or damp straw was guided through small pits beneath the floor. The scent, heavy and choking, drove rats from tunnels and kept them from nesting. It was not a trick used nightly. Smoke lingered too long, sometimes harming the very grain it was meant to protect. But when infestations grew, it was a harsh tool of last resort. Storehouses in towns used stricter methods still. Here the grain did not belong to one family, but to a whole community. Rats in such places threatened not just a meal, but survival through the winter. And so towns invested in stone granaries with doors fitted tightly and floors raised high. Guards watched not only for thieves, but for signs of rodents. Even here, tricks were woven into design. Narrow vents allowed air to circulate, but were fitted with grates too fine for whiskers to pass. Floors were paved with smooth flagstones, impossible to burrow through. Each feature was both practical and defensive. Farmers also learned the value of disturbance. Rats thrived where they felt undisturbed, nesting deep in hay or sacks left too long untouched. To prevent this, farmers made the habit of shifting piles, rolling barrels, moving sacks from one side of the barn to the other. Each movement broke hidden tunnels, scattered nests, forced the rats to begin again. It was exhausting work, but it kept stores from vanishing unnoticed. And yet, despite these efforts, barns and storehouses were never entirely free of rats. The best tricks delayed them, discouraged them, weakened them, but never defeated them. People accepted this truth, not as failure, but as reality. The battle would last as long as grain was gathered and rats existed to seek it. What mattered was persistence. Tricks repeated each season. Vigilance renewed each night. Patience carried year after year. Because barns and storehouses were more than buildings. They were vaults of survival. To protect them was to protect the family, the village, the very rhythm of life. And every trick, whether a raised post, a rattling shard, or a sudden rearrangement of sacks, was a thread in that larger defense, a quiet, enduring war, fought not with swords, but with ingenuity. Travelers faced an especially delicate struggle with rats. On the road, far from the comfort of home storerooms and carefully designed barns, their food was more exposed than ever. They carried it in leather packs, cloth sacks, and wooden boxes. At night, when they stopped at inns or barns that served as way stations, the sound of scratching often greeted them before the sound of welcome. Inns were lively places, but their kitchens and stables attracted rats as surely as any granary. For travelers, it was not enough to eat. They had to guard what little they carried, sometimes with more care than they guarded their coins. Imagine a weary traveler, boots dusty from the road, setting down his pack in a crowded common hall. Around him, voices rise and fall. The crackle of the hearth fills the room, and yet beneath it all, faint noises can be heard near the edges of the floor. Rats, bold from living among people, wait for the chance to gnaw into unattended bags. The traveler knows this, and so he reaches into his cloak to pull out a small bundle of dried herbs. Mint, tansy, or rosemary, simple plants, are tucked into the bag. The strong scent drifts outward, masking the smell of bread or cheese inside. This was one of the simplest but most trusted tricks. At inns, packs were often hung from rafters or high pegs on the wall, out of easy reach. Hooks were polished smooth, sometimes even greased to stop climbing claws. Travelers learned quickly. Leave a bag on the floor, and it would not be yours by morning. Hang it high, and you bought yourself a night of rest. Those who could not find a peg slept with their belongings under their cloaks, the bag tied to a wrist or ankle, so that even the faintest tug would wake them. Some inns, knowing their reputation depended on it, devised tricks of their own. Storerooms were fitted with raised bins, their legs capped with metal to stop gnawing. Sacks were kept off the ground, set upon platforms that leaned outward so rats could not climb them. Clever innkeepers sometimes placed small rattles, bits of pottery tied to string, near the doors of their storerooms. If a rat slipped inside, the clatter drew attention at once. Guests resting upstairs might even hear it, and though they groaned at the interruption, they slept more soundly knowing vigilance was alive below. On the road itself, tricks became simpler still. Travelers often wrapped their food in layers. A cloth tied tightly, then a second layer of rough leather. This slowed teeth and bought precious time. Some placed smooth stones or bits of metal in their sacks, rattling whenever disturbed. The noise served as both alarm and deterrent. Others chose their resting places carefully, preferring rocky ground or open clearings where rats had fewer places to hide. Even the way they built campfires mattered. Flames discouraged intruders, and ashes spread around the edge of a camp created a dry, soft barrier where paw prints could be seen come morning. These tricks may seem small, but for travelers each meant the difference between arriving hungry or strong. Inns and roads alike taught lessons. Vigilance never ended. Food must always be defended, and even in the company of strangers, one could not let their guard down. And before we wander further, let me pause here. If you're enjoying this calm journey into forgotten history, I gently invite you to subscribe. That way you'll always have a place to return when the night grows quiet and the past feels near. Markets were the stage where human life and rat life collided most openly. Unlike barns or kitchens, which were private, markets were public, and wherever sacks of grain were lifted onto stalls or baskets of bread placed on boards, the opportunity for whiskered intruders multiplied. To defend their food, merchants developed tricks that were as much about display as protection. Picture a busy marketplace at dawn. Merchants raise the shutters of their stalls, spreading out their goods while townsfolk gather with baskets in hand. Beneath the chatter of trade and the cries of sellers lies another constant sound, the faint scurrying from corners and shadows. Rats lived here, drawn by the endless supply of crumbs, peelings, and waste. And so markets became testing grounds for every trick people knew. One of the most common defenses was height. Tables were raised far above the ground, often balanced on legs set into shallow bowls of water. These bowls, filled each morning, glistened in the light and acted as moats. A rat might try the climb, only to be stopped at the smooth, wet edge. Customers noticed this and trusted such merchants more. It was not only a clever trick, but a promise that the goods were guarded. Another trick was the use of coverings. Baskets of fruit or loaves were shielded by cloths weighted at the corners with stones. The cloths kept rats from reaching in quickly and also shielded the scent from traveling too far. Merchants knew that if food smelled too strongly, it was not only customers who arrived. Strong fabrics, sometimes even thick leather covers, became a sign of care. Noise served as another weapon. Markets were rarely quiet, but merchants added their own alarms. Pieces of pottery strung under tables, shells hung from cords, or thin metal plates balanced near sacks created constant obstacles. A rat brushing against them caused a clatter loud enough to make heads turn. Some merchants even tied small bells to doors and shutters so that every opening or disturbance rang out. Certain stalls relied on texture. They scattered sand mixed with sharp grit beneath their tables, forcing rats to cross uncomfortable ground before reaching food. Others used smooth planks, polished and steep, which left no grip for tiny claws. Even the design of stalls themselves changed. Slanted sides and raised fronts kept rats from leaping directly onto the display. Perhaps the cleverest trick was rotation. Merchants knew that rats thrived on familiarity, so they changed the layout of their stalls daily. Baskets were moved, barrels turned, sacks placed in new positions. To customers, it looked like variety. To rats, it was confusion. The creature that found a path one night discovered it gone the next, and in that pause, food was spared. But markets also had guardians of a different kind, people. Children often ran between stalls, clapping hands or stomping feet, driving away intruders. Sweepers passed with brooms, pushing crumbs into piles that were burned or carried away. The noise and constant motion itself was a trick, leaving little peace for pests. And in roadside inns and public cook shops, where food was prepared for travelers and townsfolk alike, the same tricks appeared. Bread was hung in nets from beams, meat stored in bins with slanted sides, and herbs scattered to keep the air sharp. Customers saw abundance, but behind the scenes, every choice was shaped by defense. Markets, then, were more than centers of trade. They were battlefields disguised as lively streets. And every raised table, every cloth cover, every clattering shell was part of a long, unending war. A war waged not with swords, but with cleverness and persistence. If kitchens were the heart of the home, then pantries and cellars were its silent guardians. These were the places where families stored what they could not eat at once, what must last through lean days and long winters. But if a pantry was a sanctuary for food, it was also a constant temptation for rats. Darkness, quiet, and the smell of grain or cheese made these rooms irresistible. And so households turned their creativity inward, weaving tricks into the very design of these spaces. A pantry might be no larger than a closet, lined with shelves of jars and baskets. In larger homes, it could be a dedicated room, cool and shaded, with heavy doors to seal it off. Yet no matter the size, one truth remained. Without defenses, it became a banquet hall for the uninvited. People learned this quickly and adapted. One of the oldest tricks was sealing. Pantry doors were fitted with tight hinges and bottoms reinforced with strips of metal. Gaps were stuffed with cloth or wood, so no whisker could slip through. In some houses, ashes were sprinkled along thresholds, not only as deterrent, but as markers. Each morning, the ash was checked for footprints. A clean surface meant peace. Tiny tracks told a different story. It was both trap and alarm, silent but clear. Inside, shelves were raised high, far from the floor. Jars and sacks sat on boards with smooth legs, their bases sometimes resting in small dishes of water. To a rat, it was a maze of barriers. Some families added an extra step. polishing the shelf supports with oil, leaving no roughness for claws to grip. By the glow of a candle, these shelves gleamed like glass, simple wood turned into defense. Cellars, being underground, posed even greater challenges. Their cool air preserved food, but their shadows invited pests. Families learned to place storage in the center, away from walls, leaving no easy path for climbing. Baskets were hung from beams above, swaying gently when touched. Barrels stood on stone blocks, their bases out of reach. And like in barns, some cellars used mushroom-shaped supports, frustrating every attempt to climb. Scents played their role here too. Bundles of herbs, mint, tansy, lavender were hung from rafters, their fragrance filling the space. Some families even laid branches of thorny plants along ledges, forming spiny barricades that rats avoided. Imagine walking into such a cellar. The air cool, the smell of herbs sharp, the shadows deep, but the food untouched. Another clever trick was vigilance disguised as routine. Families entered their pantries daily, moving sacks, lifting lids, shifting baskets. The rats, unsettled by constant disturbance, found no safe corner to settle. Even the act of sweeping mattered. Crumbs removed, scents erased, peace disrupted. What looked like housework was in truth defense. Cellars also taught the value of sound. Quiet though they were, some families strung pottery shards along beams so that the faintest movement rang out. Children, lying awake above, learned to recognize those noises, the sudden rattle that told of an intruder in the dark. It was not fear, but awareness passed from generation to generation. In these spaces, ingenuity flourished because necessity demanded it. A single sack lost could mean hunger before the harvest. A wheel of cheese spoiled could weaken the household. So every shelf built high, every herb hung low, every jar sealed tight was not just craft, it was survival. The pantry and the cellar were meant to guard, but they were only as strong as the tricks woven into them. And in their shadows, night after night, the quiet war against rats continued, fought with wood, stone, scent, and vigilance. On land, rats were constant trouble, but at sea, they became nearly legendary. Ships were like floating villages, carrying not just sailors and cargo, but entire storerooms of food needed for long voyages. And where there was food, rats followed. In fact, many ships set out already carrying them, hidden in coils of rope, tucked into barrels, or scurrying through the bilge. Sailors quickly learned that to survive at sea, they had to guard their supplies as fiercely as their sails. The first trick at sea was containment. Food on ships was stored in barrels bound tight with iron hoops. Unlike barrels in barns, these were often double-layered, with extra stays or lids coated in pitch to seal gaps. Sailors inspected them constantly, tapping the sides for hollow sounds that betrayed gnawing. If a barrel was compromised, it was moved at once to a safer spot, or its contents redistributed. The sea offered no chance to replace what was lost. Every bite mattered. Raising food off the deck was another necessity. Sacks of grain were never left where claws could reach. Instead, they were lashed to beams above or tucked into nets hung from rafters. These nets swayed with the motion of the ship, turning every rat's climb into a precarious gamble. Some sailors even greased the ropes, watching as rats slid back down into the shadows below. The trick was simple. yet endlessly effective. Ships also used barriers. Food lockers were lined with smooth planks, their seams filled with tar, leaving no cracks to exploit. Some captains ordered thin sheets of metal nailed around storage hatches, a costlier but more secure solution. The faint gleam of polished copper or tin reflected in lantern light, a silent promise that food was guarded. Herbs played a role at sea as well. Bundles of strong scented plants were tucked into corners of holds, their pungency discouraging intruders. Sailors swore by mint and tansy, claiming they worked even better at sea than on land. Whether true or not, the practice persisted, a ritual as common as coiling rope or mending sails. Noise, too, became a trick. Small bells were tied to nets or storage lids. In the rolling silence of the ocean night, even the faintest chime echoed loud. Sailors grew used to it, waking quickly at the sound, chasing shadows with sticks or boots. It became part of the rhythm of life aboard, the creak of timbers, the crash of waves, the sudden ring of a bell in the dark. Some ships carried cats, companions, and hunters both, yet no captain relied on them alone. Tricks of design, habit, and vigilance remained the real defense. The sea was too unforgiving to trust chance. A rat that reached the bread stores could ruin weeks of rations. One that gnawed through rope might even endanger the ship itself. And so sailors lived in constant watchfulness. They ate quickly, cleaned carefully, stored cautiously. Every night, lanterns were checked, barrels inspected, nets tested. The ocean offered no mercy, and neither did the rats. But with clever tricks and endless persistence, sailors endured. Because at sea, food was more than sustenance. It was survival in its purest form, and guarding it from whiskered thieves was as much a duty as steering the ship or tending the sails. In the homes of the wealthy, where halls were wide and storerooms deep, one might expect the problem of rats to vanish. Yet the truth was the opposite. More food meant more temptation, and greater abundance meant greater risk. A rat did not distinguish between a poor farmer's sack of grain and a nobleman's chest of dried fruits. It sought both with equal hunger, and so in grand houses and manors, people developed tricks that were both practical and elegant, blending necessity with display. The first trick was architecture itself. Wealthy households often built larders as stone rooms within the house, thick-walled and windowless. Doors were reinforced with iron, hinges fitted so tightly that even the slimmest whisker could not squeeze through. Floors were raised, sometimes made of smooth tiles polished to a sheen. These choices were not for beauty alone. They were defenses written into the very structure of the home. Inside, food was stored with as much care as jewels. Shelves were carved from hardwood, their legs capped with polished metal. The metal rings shone in the candlelight, but their purpose was simple. No rat could climb past them. Barrels stood on stone plinths, their bases too wide for claws to reach. Chests were lined with tin or copper, smooth and cold to the touch, impossible to chew. Wealth provided materials, but it was cleverness that turned them into barriers. Servants were part of the defense, too. They rotated duties, entering storerooms at intervals to sweep, inspect, and rearrange. Nothing was left too long in one place. Baskets were shifted daily, lids lifted and resealed, sacks moved from corner to corner. The constant disturbance unsettled intruders, leaving no chance for nests to take hold. For the wealthy, vigilance was as much a routine as feasting. Strong scents filled these spaces just as they did in humbler homes. Lavender bundles hung from beams, rosemary sprigs tucked into sacks, mint leaves scattered on shelves. But in grand houses, these herbs served a double role. They deterred pests, while also perfuming the air for visitors. Guests might admire the fragrance without realizing it was also a quiet line of defense. Perhaps the most curious trick was the use of false coverings. Wealthy households sometimes placed empty barrels or jars near entrances, objects with no food inside. Rats, attracted to the smell of wood or dust, investigated these first, wasting time while real stores remained untouched. It was a form of decoy, simple yet effective. And of course, the wealthy could afford guardians. Dogs patrolled courtyards, and cats prowled kitchens. Yet even they were not trusted alone. The true defense lay in the combination of all things: stone, metal, herbs, vigilance, and routine. Together they made storerooms that were less vulnerable than most, though never invincible. Because rats, as ever, adapted. They found cracks in mortar, slipped through forgotten gaps, and gnawed through softer woods. No matter the wealth of the household, the war never ended. The difference was only in the number of tricks at one's disposal. And before we step into the final chapter, let me pause just once more. If you've enjoyed wandering through these quiet defenses, I gently invite you to subscribe. It helps you return easily to these long journeys through history, where each night unfolds another calm story. Every family that lived with food and shadow carried not only tools and habits, but memories. Tricks against rats were not written in books for the common household. They were whispered at the table, shown in the kitchen, repeated in the barn. A child sweeping crumbs into the fire learned why it mattered. A servant balancing a barrel on a stone plinth absorbed the reason without a word. And as the years passed, these habits became traditions, woven into the rhythm of life. What made these tricks endure was not perfection, but persistence. Rats never truly disappeared. They gnawed, they scurried, they adapted. Yet people adapted too, always one step ahead, sometimes clever, sometimes desperate, but always determined. The war was never about victory. It was about endurance. To keep enough food safe for another day, another week, another season, that was enough. Some tricks grew into architecture, like raised granaries with mushroom-shaped posts. Others lingered in herbs hung above shelves, their fragrance as much a part of the home as the bread it protected. Still others lived in the quiet rituals, moving sacks, rattling pots, sweeping thoroughly, checking footprints in ash. These gestures, repeated countless times, became second nature. In towns, markets, barns, kitchens, ships, and manors, the story was the same. Rats pressed forward. People responded. Each setting had its own defenses, yet all shared a single truth. Food was life, and life must be guarded. To protect a loaf or a sack of grain was to protect health, family, and the fragile comfort of tomorrow. As centuries turned, newer tools would come, but the older tricks never fully vanished. In quiet villages, herbs were still scattered. In markets, stalls still stood high. In storerooms, shelves were still polished smooth. These echoes remind us that even the smallest enemy can shape daily life. teaching lessons of patience, attention, and ingenuity. And so, as we step away from these long shadows and whispered scurries, we see the story not of rats alone, but of people. People who built defenses out of wood and stone, out of scent and sound, out of vigilance and habit. People who endured, not by erasing the threat, but by living with it carefully, cleverly, persistently. That persistence is the quiet thread tying past to present. It shows us that history is not only in great battles or crowned rulers, but in the nightly defense of bread on a shelf, grain in a sack, cheese in a cellar. It lies in the small tricks that kept hunger at bay, passed from one hand to the next, generation after generation. And in those simple, enduring tricks, the story of human resilience is written.